Sign.
Okay, good to go. Okay, thank you. So, item number 6, matters arising. There are none. So, we're moving then into item number 7, which is EU Regulation 2025/40 on the packaging of waste, and we're going to have departmental oral evidence. Just to let everybody know, this item will be recorded by Hansard. The relevant papers are at page 5 of the meeting pack and page 3 of table pack. So the Food Standards Agency assessment of impact is at page 188 of the meeting pack, and the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs assessment of impact on the published act is at page 8. So we had an updated explanatory memorandum requested from the British Government on the 18th of December after the text of the proposal had been formally adopted, and that updated EM was received yesterday evening and has been shared with members via email. So everybody should have got that. Paragraph 18 to 20 of the EM sets out which parts of the EU Act will apply under Article 13.3 of the Windsor Framework. Paragraph 19 of the EM lists a number of articles of the regulation which won't apply under Article 13.3, so we're only dealing with the ones that will apply. So, therefore, the remaining articles of regulation outside of those listed at paragraph 19 of the EM are under consideration, and these will be referred to as the Replacement EU Act for ease, including later on whenever I ask the question on whether or not to conduct an inquiry. So, at our meeting on the 16th of January, the committee agreed to provide departmental officials with a set of questions in advance of the oral session and requested these be answered as part of their evidence. So to assist members in formulating supplementary questions during the evidence session, the committee also agreed that officials would be asked to share their prepared responses in writing before the start of the meeting. Questions were shared with their officials following their last appearance, and with FSA officials following receipt of the assessment of impact on Monday afternoon. So these questions can be found at page 13 of the meeting pack, and the written responses from DERA can be found at page 3 of the table pack. Responses from the FSA have been shared with members via email. So committee will need to take a decision whether to hold an inquiry, and will do so following the evidence session. So can I just welcome Colin Breen, Assistant Director Waste Policy from DERA, and Sharon Gilmore, Head of Standard and Dietary Health Food Standards Agency. So you are both very welcome.
Thank you, Chair.
So I'm not sure who's going to lead first, but it's over to yourselves just to present
Thanks, Chair. We had given the introduction all 2 weeks ago. Do you want us to run through it all again, or would you like to dig into it?
Very quickly, just go through it, because we have Hansard here, and this evidence will be useful just to help us decide whether we have an inquiry or not.
Okay, so just in terms of the packaging waste directive, or packaging waste regulations, which replaced the packaging waste directive, and it really was born out of an EU aim to deliver a more circular economy, tackle the waste generated through packaging, and promote reuse and refill options, so that we're not just always in the throwaway culture. It was changed from a directive to a regulation to ensure that it directly applied in all member states and through the Windsor framework in Northern Ireland. So some of the main highlights: it's going to govern the design of packaging. It's going to require a reduction in packaging volumes, a minimisation of packaging waste, and a minimisation of empty space in packaging. It will mandate some separate collection of packaging waste. It will result in the introduction of some new labelling and other requirements, such as deposit return schemes and extended producer responsibility, which are something that are being worked on across 4 nations and 3 nations respectively. It will amend the Single-Use Plastic Directive. So the EU impact assessment, it has sort of, I suppose, the main points there. In 2009 in the EU there were 68 million tonnes of packaging. By 2019 that had grown to 78.5 million, and it's projected to continue growing for the next number of years if something's not done. One of the main sort of plus points out of the EU impact assessment was really that it suggests that there will be approximately 600,000 new jobs in circular economy type activities as a result of this. Impact on businesses. So there will be impact on a range of businesses, both within the EU and outside of the EU, because there's a mirror clause within the packaging waste regulations. So anything that anybody is importing into the EU from another country will have to comply with the same requirements. There will be a number of exemptions, particularly for SMEs, etc. I think it's important to say, and I outlined this the last time, there are a number of areas we just don't know yet. While the regulation is about 200 pages long with 70 articles, there's an awful lot of information missing that's going to be completed or followed up with delegated acts and implementing acts. And I made an estimation that probably see 1,000 plus pages of those over the years. Many of the targets are still quite far away, so some of the targets are 2040, a number of the targets are 2030. So there is still a lot of information to gather on that. As I mentioned, there's quite a slant towards extended producer responsibility. That's a scheme that's already well developed within the UK. There's also a deposit return scheme, and that is being well developed on a 3-nation basis as far as I understand it now in the UK. And I think really that's the main points by way of an introduction or background, and we've both, I'm very glad the FSA has come along too here, so we've both provided answers to the questions, and I don't know if you'd like me to run through any of the answers initially or if you'd like to dig into them.
I mean, we probably will take it separately. I have a few questions. So we've obviously received an updated EM, so there's a raft of articles that we're now aware of that aren't going to apply, so perhaps just a bit of detail in relation to that, because I mean they're not going to apply, so that's going to lessen anything. And you talked about information not known, so I'm not sure if that was specifically to some of these articles that aren't going to apply, but in terms of information not known with regard to articles that are going to apply, we're not going to have that information within the next 4-week period anyway, so just looking clarification on that as well.
I haven't actually received the EM. Did you get it from DEFRA very recently? I hadn't got it by end of yesterday.
Last night?
Right, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I just in front of me, so like Article 34, 43, 29 to 33, 44 to 47, 48, 49, 50, 12, 63, all of these aren't going to apply. 13.4, they're going to apply for the purposes of this. They're not going to apply under Article 13.3a, which is what we're looking at today. They may apply later under an Article 13.4 applicability motion. So that's a raft. So you didn't receive the EM. I should have probably asked that question at the start.
No, I haven't received the EM. I do have a list of all the articles, and I can talk you through any of them.
Can I ask the clerk maybe just to come in on this point?
I'm just going to suggest that one of the Secretariat team provide you with a copy of the EM, and if you move then to the FSA, okay, we can then come back.
Is that all right?
Okay.
Sorry, Colin, we're catching you on the hop here.
Sure. I'm wondering if it's appropriate that we've previously taken a break so that members could have a chance to read the EM. Would it be appropriate to take a short break to allow the officials to read the?
I'm happy. You didn't receive the? No. Okay. Are you okay? I mean, I'm happy enough that we might actually. Well, I was going to say we could actually go on to other items and come back to it. Maybe no. No, we'll suspend for 5 minutes. How's that? Okay.
Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. signed. Committee Room 30, 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 Sound. 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 Committee Room 30, Sound.
Receive confirmation. Good to go? Okay, so we're just going to, can we ask broadcasting again to bring in our 3 online members, and we're just going to resume the meeting. So we have now, everybody has been given time to read the updated explanatory memorandum. So Sharon, we're going to start with you just in terms of yourself presenting evidence to the committee.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Chair and members of the committee, for the opportunity to brief you this morning. I would just like to make it clear I'm here today to answer your questions on food contact materials and the elements of the EU legislation that we're talking about. The Food Standards Agency has responsibility for the safety of food contact materials, protecting the public from risks associated with chemicals that might transfer onto food from materials the food comes in contact with, including packaging. The key thing to note from an FSA perspective is that all packaging that is intended to come into contact with food or is already in contact with food must meet food safety requirements, and that will continue to be the case when this regulation comes into operation. The regulation also bans the substance PFAS from food contact packaging in response to a documented public health concern. This is not expected to be a significant concern for the Northern Ireland-based producers. The UK government is also actively considering this issue. So that is my sort of main introduction. So I'm here to provide reassurance for the committee that food safety requirements will continue for food contact materials. It's a highly regulated policy area where food contact materials are regulated and authorised with the products they contain and with the processes.
Okay, and thank you very much for that. So obviously the committee have a number of things to look at. One is the negative impact that's liable to persist. So, I mean, I'm usually very blunt just asking that question. Do you see any negative impact that's liable to persist from a food safety or food standards point of view?
This particular regulation, the packaging and packaging waste regulation, takes in the whole life cycle of packaging. We are very specific, and there are 3 key areas that we're involved in through this. It's a requirement for substances in packaging, and it's mentioned in the EM today around the prohibition of PFAS in packaging materials, recycled material content in plastic packaging, and then the reuse and refill obligations for takeaways. And we do not in the FSA see any particular concern with regards to this regulation, as the food safety requirements are in place. It doesn't bring into doubt any of the current safety protections for consumers.
Okay, I appreciate that. Just going to hand back to Colin. Colin, so you've now had a bit of a chance to look through the EM. I understand it probably wasn't maybe as long as you'd want to interrogate it, but on the basis of now having seen it, is there anything that you want to add or maybe delete from what you said earlier?
Well, yeah, so I suppose one of the positives of the EM is that the green procurement won't apply, because it would have been a little tricky. There are some areas that I wouldn't go as far as to say concern, but that will need a bit further looking at, and the UK government have committed to trying to align where possible. For example, Article 7, recycled content, whilst it is similar to the UK plastic packaging tax, it's not necessarily the same. The percentage of recycled content is slightly higher, and it's also likely, although can't say with any certainty, that the EU one will be a hard and fast, you must have your recycled content in, whereas the UK plastic packaging tax, you can pay the tax if you don't have the necessary level of recycled content in. In terms of labelling of packaging, again, there's a potential risk there. There was a potential risk with extended producer responsibility as well, so the UK government delayed the labelling decision on that. And I know they're actively looking at how to align both, because it makes sense to. Most or a lot of GB producers are going to be selling into the EU as well as into Northern Ireland and GB, so having one label instead of 2. But that was an area that some of the stakeholders just are keeping a close eye on, they've said. Some of the bans of single-use plastics, and I did say I think there's a typo in the EM, as it says 2040, and I believe Article 25 states 2030. The industry are generally moving in that direction anyway, and the extra costs from extended producer responsibility are likely to mean largely those small single-use packages aren't as prevalent, but it's just another one we have to keep an eye on. I think that would probably be the main slightly grey areas until we get the delegated and implementing acts, but the things in the EM are certainly making it much more positive in terms, because all of the packaging waste regulations aims around building a circular economy, making things more environmentally sustainable, are very good, and something I think we should all be striving for. And indeed, all 4 nations in the UK and most nations of the EU have all publicly stated that's what they're striving for. So the stakeholders in the industry are generally moving in that direction anyway. It is just a few bits of information still needed on full alignment.
So, again, I'm going to try and condense this down. Overall, in the tenets of the legislation isn't going to have a negative impact. On the whole, it's actually a positive. And from the updated British government EM, they're saying they're expected there's going to be no regulatory barriers, and that there's going to be no impact in trade between the North and Britain, and they don't see any difference in product availability here than elsewhere. So, are those things that you would agree with?
Provided that the GB does align with the EU rules, and I can't instantly think of a good reason why they wouldn't, then yes, it'll be moving in a very environmentally sustainable way, implementing a better circular economy, and this regulation would be very positive for the environment. But there is always that question mark until we are sure of alignment, but we're not going to know that in 4 weeks, as you have said.
Yep. Okay. David?
Thank you very much, Chair. What I'm taking from your previous answer is that we don't have enough information there, and in order to make it a decision around those things. Could I ask though, in terms of how it would affect perhaps the NI retail movement scheme and pre-packaged products that might be coming into Northern Ireland? Is there any danger that we're going to see a lot of products that might otherwise be available to consumers in GB using packaging that perhaps doesn't yet align with these regulations? Therefore, then, because Northern Ireland's a relatively small market relative to the rest of the UK, then those products not being available to us in Northern Ireland, is there likely to be an impact in that sense?
Yeah, with food contact materials, the legislation's included in the annex of the Windsor framework. So food contact materials, as of now, can come through the Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme. So the availability of products that are manufactured in GB are still available here in Northern Ireland. So a coffee shop purchasing, say, coffee cups from a GB manufacturer of those materials, that is still available within Northern Ireland.
Even if there is divergence in future in terms of the regulations relating to that packaging?
Yes, there is, because it's included in the annex of the Windsor framework, the food contact materials specific regulations. Yes.
Thanks very much. Also, just as a sort of side point, you'd referenced the amount of jobs that may come out of this in terms of the circular economy. Can I ask, just out of curiosity, is that they largely private sector jobs, or are we talking? Because it's a positive thing to look at jobs, but if those jobs are, represent weight that's going to be going on to our public sector or councils or so on to, put these processes in place, then it's just as much of a liability as it is we can talk about jobs, but equally that's cost.
Yeah, so the impact assessment of the EU doesn't explicitly state it, and that's probably due to the fact that each country has a different sort of way of working. That sometimes
how many jobs was it? Did you say?
600,000.
So 600,000 jobs. I mean, that's significant. Even if there was a fraction of that was to go on to our public sector, I think that would be significant. So I think that's something we need to know before we're saying that all of these jobs, isn't it wonderful? I understand what you're saying, but I just think that we need to be careful in terms of looking at jobs themselves as a positive, because it depends who's paying for it, and if it's the taxpayer, then it's something we need to bear in mind, but that's a separate issue. Thanks very much.
Okay. I'm not sure you were arguing against not creating jobs, David, there. I'm not going to put words in your mouth.
I don't think our budgets are great for it at the moment.
Does anybody else have any questions? Jonathan?
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so just firstly to Deirdre, is it still your position that you're unable to advise whether or not the regulation would have a significant impact liable to persist?
Can't fully say that. The UK government are certainly saying their ambition is to align everywhere possible. The explanatory memorandum does take out some of the sort of the more concerning and more administrative burdensome type activities, but I couldn't state with absolute certainty at this stage because, and I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, there is still quite a few unknowns, because while the regulation is big, it doesn't give enough detail, and we still aren't far enough along the road in terms of UK definitely aligning with this for me to say for definite.
So Deirdre's position is still that they're unable to advise whether or not the regulation would have a significant impact liable to persist. That is still the position from Deirdre, having read, I know you've had very little time to probably read that updated AM, but that is still the position.
I don't think I can with full certainty say that it will not. There are still, there are still some areas that, as I outlined a few minutes ago, that we can't be entirely sure there would be full alignment on.
Okay.
I don't believe any of them are so major as to impact the everyday lives of everyone, but they will certainly they could impact some people. I know
Sorry, going ahead.
I was just going to say, like, I know the test is quite high in terms of impacting everybody's daily life. Most of the things I'm mentioning are, I don't think I'd go as far as to say niche, but things like shampoo, small individual shampoo bottles being banned in hotels, things like that. They're going to have an impact, but I wouldn't say they'd have a significant impact on everyday lives.
Okay, so obviously we know that it's a significant piece of legislation and differs significantly in scope. So can I ask you then, in the substance areas where currently there is no UK government policy or it's in very early development stage? So I'm thinking about, requirement for all packaging to be placed on the EU market to be recyclable, a minimum recycled contact requirements for plastic packaging, a prohibition of certain types of single-use packaging for food, condiments and cosmetic products, requirements around packaging size, space and design, targets for reusable packaging in beverage, transport, retail sectors, restrictions on concentration of certain chemicals in food packaging, requirements for certain packaging items to be compostable, fees for producers placing packaging on the EU market for the first time, a requirement to set up a deposit scheme for single-use packets and metal cans. So all of these areas, there may be more. The UK government either don't have a policy position or it's in very early development stage. Are you in a position to highlight particular products, consumer products, that would impact upon particularly those that would transit from GB to Northern Ireland?
So I suppose a number of those areas are related to the extended producer responsibility and deposit return scheme, which are well advanced and the UK government has committed to aligning with the EU on. The banning of single-use plastic packaging. That's largely things like sauce sachets in cafes, that sort of thing. I'm not aware of exactly where they're transported to or from, but there is a possibility that them not being available in Northern Ireland will cause some people annoyance, but I don't think it's. Well, again, this is only my personal view. I don't think it's a major impact. Those sort of things. The reuse and refill parts, a lot of them are, on digging into the legislation a bit further, a lot of them are, best endeavours as opposed to hard and fast targets. So again, they shouldn't have a major impact. And I note the FSN, maybe they'll want to say a bit more of that they had sort of considered that perhaps, and I know their thoughts are at an early stage, I don't want to say too much, I'll let Sharon come in a second, but perhaps, in a supermarket, for example, the loose fruit and veg area could be considered to be a reuse or refill type area where you come back with your previous bag and use the fruit and veg again. Do you want to say anything on that, Sharon?
Yes, that's an example, Colin, committee that we have considered, but we would need further analysis really to identify and further implementing regulations as well to really see the impact of this on the retail sector, not just food but non-food as well. Now, you may be aware that we are carrying out a mapping exercise at the moment on grocery retail outlets in Northern Ireland for wider policy, which includes the estimated size of the premises. So that information should be available at the end of March, beginning of April, and we can work with our DERA colleagues on this to help make an assessment of the impact of this particular one article.
So the reuse and refill is one of the articles that's not actually applying in the article that we're looking at today. Am I correct in that?
Some of them do and some of them don't. I was just looking through it there. So I think a lot of the
54
don't
apply.
Yeah, some of the reuse and refill articles do. I haven't had a chance to go through the whole legislation, but I had a quick scan because initially I thought none of them apply, but some of them do. So again, that's ideally I would have had the EM a bit sooner to look at that. But there are definitely some of those reuse and refill obligations that will apply, or according to this EM.
Jonathan, are you finished?
Can I continue, Chair?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. So do DERA have a comprehensive list of potential products that will be impacted by this regulation? Consumer products?
No.
No. Okay. The last question from me on this one would be, so obviously you talked about you hadn't received any information from stakeholders. I think some of there was loose engagement with the Food and Drinks Federation. So we know there's quite a considerable industry out there. Is there no concern coming back? Why are we not seeing further engagement as to what the potential impact would be?
Yeah, well, we've had some conversations, and the main one, the Food and Drink Federation, have had a few calls with them. They've spoken to their members, and their main area of interest and possible concern was around labelling and the risk of dual labelling. I know the EM has now strengthened that a bit to say UK government will look at harmonising all that labelling, but that was the main concern that's come back there. We have been largely trying to understand the regulation ourselves over the last few weeks, and we will be doing more stakeholder engagement on it.
Would it be your opinion that given some of these significant areas of policy change, that the industry themselves have not been able to fully scrutinise and analyse their particular impact to their given field?
Oh yes, well, I haven't seen this till this morning, so I would very much doubt the industry even knows about most of this yet. It's the things not applying are a positive, but you'd have to look at it all its entirety, see exactly what still does apply before I could draw a really good opinion. And like I say, there's so many articles. I was whizzing back and forward through the legislation to try and work out what applied and didn't apply. For example, I noted that Article 34 carrier bags doesn't apply. And that was one of the positives they had, that we've almost certainly met that one. So there's one that I thought I can tick one off that I'd achieved. Now it's gone. Okay. Although we've done some good work in carrier bags, and we're not going to negate that.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Chair.
Colin, carry on the good work. We don't need legislation to ensure that we're doing good work.
Peter. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Colin, and thank you for not only your candour this morning, but also obviously your reading documentation that's just been provided to you, and that's always challenging. I mean, what I picked up, and just following on a little bit from my colleague there, and we've tried to sort of tease this out, and it's not fair to put you directly on this position, but in your earlier evidence, you said there's a number of areas we really don't know yet. And that could be related to what the Chair's been sort of talking about, some of these things that may or may not apply in this context. And you also said I took it down, there's quite a few unknowns, and I understand that, and the committee understand that as well. And I think you then went on to explain that by saying that the UK government is committed to the current government committed not to raise taxes before the election, and then the first thing they did was to raise taxes, as far as I'm aware. And my sense this morning is, and certainly the position I have, is that there's a lot of, to use your phrase, unknowns in this. My feeling is that there's a lot of things that DAERA don't know in terms of the impact, and colleague Johnny just asked about the scope in terms of retail products that may or may not be affected by it. I mean, would you say, because I'm not going to put word, but would you say that is the case, that there's quite a bit that you feel today that is unknown about this in terms of its implications, not only in terms of the purchase of goods and sale of goods in Northern Ireland, but in terms of what's going to apply?
Okay, so I suppose the single biggest unknown, and Chair's alluded to this one, is that many of these things aren't going to come in for many years, and the implementing acts may not come in, delegated acts may not come in for many years. So there's going to be a lot of unknowns until 2030 plus with this piece of legislation. Always makes me a bit uneasy to know that. There is the obvious unknown about full alignment. UK government have committed to it. I'll not get into the other points about that, but I can only take them at their word. They certainly did hold off on the EPR labelling when they realised there was an issue, and committed to looking at that and getting it to align. It makes sense to anybody to align. Why would you want to run two different labelling schemes whenever you're selling so much to the EU? And the whole world, anybody that is placing packaging on the market in the EU will have to comply with this. GB businesses placing packaging on the market in Northern Ireland will have to comply with this. Sharon has talked about the NARMS retail movement scheme and how that will negate some things around food contact materials, etc. But yes, I wish I was in a better position to even before I got this EM, some of the articles didn't apply. There is an awful lot of unknowns within the regulations because of the way it's drafted. A lot of the things, for example, will apply within 24 months of an implementing act, or else 5 years within whichever is later, things like that. So there is an awful lot of information to come on this. That is not going to come in the next few weeks. I would imagine it's not going to come in the next few months. A lot of it maybe won't come for a couple of years. So yeah, I don't know. I'm sort of going round in circles here with myself, but it is definitely, there are definitely unknowns, and I have to be honest about that. Always makes me uneasy. I like to know exactly what something means.
I'm sure the committee would concur with that, because we're obviously being asked to look at this and give an opinion on it. And I'm very wary of giving sanction to something that we don't really know how it's going to impact. That is not good scrutiny, I don't think. No, look, that's been very useful. The only thing I'd pick up just on what you said there was, for GB businesses to sell into Northern Ireland in terms of dual labelling, that would just make sense. It doesn't automatically follow that just because that's right that the government will just do that. They'll say, well, my goodness, there has to be dual labelling here. We'll have to, rationalise this and make sure there's just one, so these goods can be sold into Northern Ireland.
Not all of them will seek to supply the EU, is the other thing. So
yeah.
And I was talking about this yesterday with some of my colleagues, and said, I can't say that it's likely or not likely that there will be the same label. In my head it makes, and in everybody's head it makes complete common sense to do so, and I can't see a reason why you wouldn't. But then, that's as much as I suppose I can say about it, that it would make absolute sense to do it, and all of the industry would want to see it for something like this. But that's unfortunately that's as far as I can take it.
No, and good sense doesn't always translate into policy, has been my experience. But look, I really appreciate your candour and evidence this morning, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to come back in again and then on, just because we obviously have to make a decision today on whether we have an inquiry or not. And if we have an inquiry, you'll be back here next week and we'll be asking you these same questions, and you won't be able to answer any of these questions on alignment or implementation acts because you just won't know them then either.
Sure, can I make a point on that? An inquiry is the mechanism by which this committee is able to formalise what it has heard and give a view on what it has heard. We're doing this, I understand, when we've time, we hear these things before we need to because of the timeline once we launch an inquiry. I completely get that. But it may be that we don't need to go over everything in an inquiry again, but an inquiry is the mechanism by which we're able to give a view on something, and therefore I think it may be necessary at times to have the inquiry even if we've heard most of the evidence.
We'll come to the inquiry at that point, Owen.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Colin and Sharon, for your evidence. It's been really insightful and helpful, actually, in guiding us through this decision. Colin, it was just when you had mentioned the work that the Departmental had already been doing around plastic bags. It made me think, to what extent does potential compliance with this regulation complement or conflict with the targets that the executive already has on issues like recycling and the circular economy?
So there's nothing in this that would conflict with any of that. It would all help towards it. Some of them are more ambitious. There's certainly some of them more ambitious than the current UK Plastic Pact, which Deirdre and many businesses throughout the UK are signed up to. It's definitely the direction of travel of the industry. There's been, from my limited engagement and just from talking to stakeholders informally at various things, they would be broadly supportive of the ambition, the direction of travel. There are some concerns. Obviously, you don't want to be having 2 production lines set up for 2 sets of labelling. UK government have done all they can at this stage to allay those concerns, and as far as I understand, they're going to consult fairly soon on that alignment. And as I've said, I have to take them at their word, because they certainly stepped up on the EPR labelling. Northern Ireland, a very small market, it would have been very easy to go ahead with the EPR labelling as it was for 97% of their market, but they didn't. But certainly everything in this will help towards implementing a more circular economy. Everything in it will help towards striving for more recycling. Yes, there's a bit of an administrative burden in terms of some of the targets and data reporting, but it's a number of those articles that have been not applied. The green public procurement was one that I was particularly shaky on, but it's not going to apply, which is good. But there are direction of travel, excellent. I think it's very ambitious. I'm an environmentalist, I suppose I have to say that too. So I think it's very ambitious and noteworthy that it was agreed at such a level of ambition across the EU. I suppose that's really it on that.
No, that's helpful, Colin. Thank you.
Okay, Colin and Sharon, I think that's been very helpful and very, very useful, so appreciate you giving up your time. So, members, under paragraph 8.1 of Schedule 6B of the 1998 Act, Committee must decide today whether or not to hold an inquiry into the published Replacement EU Act that has been notified. Should the committee fail to decide, sorry, you are free to go. Sorry.
Thank you.
You can't. You can stay and listen to me talking if you want, but you are free to go. Sorry, apologies. So, should the committee fail to decide, the failure will be treated as a decision not to hold an inquiry. So, members, having had regard to the legal advice and whether it appears likely the Replacement EU Act significantly differs in whole or in part from the content or scope of the EU instruments which it amends or replaces, and the departmental assessment on whether it appears likely that the Replacement Act would have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities here in a way that is liable to persist, do members wish to hold an inquiry into Regulation EU 2025/40 on the packaging and packaging of waste? David.
Thank you, Chair. I think from the evidence we've heard, it is very clear that at the very least there is not sufficient knowledge of what may be coming forward, and on that basis, as I outlined, in order that this committee should bring forward its formal view on these things, I think we should hold an inquiry, and that's my proposal.
Okay. Any alternative proposals? Well, I'm going to make an alternative proposal. I mean, I think that on the basis of what we heard from, first of all, what we've got in the EM in terms of alignment and trade and no impact, and also what we heard from officials with regard to the impact and the positivity of this, I think it doesn't meet the second test in terms of serious impact, which is liable to persist. So I'm going to suggest that we don't have an inquiry. Go on.
No, thank you, Chair. And I have some sympathy with David's perspective, given that, to be fair, the EM did arrive again fairly last minute. However, I think the EM does provide significant comfort on a number of issues. So the commitment from the UK government to explore alignment on this issue, I think, is absolutely critical, and something that certainly from my perspective I would encourage, and is the solution to a lot of the issues that arise from regulations that come before this committee. The clarity around those quite hefty items within the regulation that are now out of scope, I think, changes the landscape considerably. It's also the fact that we won't have any clarity in the coming weeks around the UK's intention on alignment. we won't have any clarity on implementing and delegated acts for potentially decades in some instances. And even in terms of the Food Standards Agency's mapping exercise, that's not due to report until March or April. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily the end of the road. I think certainly from my perspective, in a party political capacity, I would be intending to lobby the UK government around that alignment piece. But from the perspective of this committee, I don't see the value in a 4-week inquiry and what we could possibly add to the dialogue and the debate around this particular regulation.
And yeah, your last point I should have added to my rationale for it as well, because that is the key point. So I have some sympathy with regard to what we're hearing from the side of the meeting room in regard to unknown, but the fact is we aren't going to know it in the time frame that we have, which is essentially why I think an inquiry based on what we've had is going to come to a pretty conclusion.
I recognise that, Chair. I'm taking into consideration as well that one of the possible outcomes of an inquiry is that we do not have enough information to make a decision, and therefore I think it's important that the committee registers that decision, but I understand that's not sure.
Okay, anyway, we've got two proposals. So David's proposal first, that we have an inquiry. So can I ask all those in favour of an inquiry to raise their hand? Okay, and those opposed?
Okay. The question proposed by the Deputy Chairperson, the inquiry conducted into 2025-40, the PPWR. Ayes, we have David Brooks, Jonathan Buckley, Peter Martin. Noes, we have Philip McGuigan, Declan Kearney, Emma Sheeran, Owen Tennyson and Kate Nichol. So the proposal falls.
Okay, so no inquiry. So we're just going to move to next item of business, which is number 8 on our agenda, Regulation EU 2025-41 on import, export and transit measures for firearms, essential components and ammunition. And we're going to have departmental oral evidence. Just again to inform everybody, Hansard are going to record this. Relevant papers are at pages 215 of our meeting pack. The Department of Justice assessment of impact is at page 304 of the meeting pack. And as with previous items, packaging of waste, questions in relation to this EU Act were shared with DOJ officials following receipt of their assessment of impact. And on Monday afternoon, and these questions can be found at page 222. DOJ officials were requested to answer these questions during today's evidence session to share their prepared responses in writing before the start of the meeting. A written response from DOJ has been shared with members via email. The committee will need to take a decision whether to hold an inquiry, and will do so following the evidence session. So can I welcome Jennifer Stewart, who's Head of Firearms and Explosives Branch, Department of Justice, and Claire Duncan, Deputy Head of Firearms and Explosives Branch within the Department of Justice. So we're just going to hand over to yourself to present the evidence to the committee today, and then we'll ask a few questions once you're finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Well, as you said, I'm Jennifer Stewart, and this is my colleague Claire, and we're from the Firearms and Explosives Branch in the Department of Justice. Our branch has policy responsibility for devolved firearms matters in Northern Ireland, and it might be helpful to know that the Home Office is the lead GB department for firearms policy. In respect of this EU regulation, Cabinet Office is coordinating responses from UKG, and because it relates to import and export matters, it's the responsibility of the Department for Business and Trade. In respect of import and export matters, these are reserved under the Northern Ireland Act, so it's outside the competence of the Department of Justice. You'd been notified of the adoption of this new EU regulation, which is intended to tighten import and export controls around the illicit manufacturing and trafficking of firearms, their essential components and ammunition. By better information sharing between member states, the existing regulation that this is updating has been in place since 2012. Certain articles of the new regulation will apply from February the 11th, but the majority of the provisions won't actually take effect until February 2029. We are aware that Cabinet Office will be coordinating the preparation of an explanatory memorandum. You have provided some questions to us in advance of this morning's session, and we've tried to answer these as best we can, given that the matters fall outside our remit. And we had provided some observations on the proposed regulation back in summer 2024, but we haven't as yet seen the UKG agreed explanatory memorandum. We don't believe that there are significant numbers of movements of firearms between NI and GB that would fall under this regulation. So we don't expect there to be a significant impact in that regard. Obviously, it's dealing with illicit manufacturing and trafficking, so won't be covering the legal stuff that we would tend to see. So if you've any questions, we can try and answer them.
I mean, again, just at the end there, I mean, in terms of your written assessment of evidence, you're saying this is intended to address illicit activities, doesn't affect the application of, which relates to firearms for civilian use, and the department welcomes any proposals to address illegal activity. And your conclusion, I should ask your conclusion rather than inferring it, but you did say that you don't envisage this having any particular negative impact on that's continued liable to persist.
Certainly from our perspective, we're not seeing anything that would suggest that there would be a major issue. Obviously, the import and export controls are outside our area of responsibility, but the new regulation does say that it shouldn't impact the weapons directive that relates to the civilian use that we would see. So, and we believe that numbers that move between GB and I will be relatively small. So,
thank you. Members, any other questions? Jonathan?
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I suppose probably in an earlier UK explanatory memorandum, it stated plainly that it would lead to regulatory divergence between GB and Northern Ireland. But later it went on to say in terms of MP engagement that it would have minimal impact on importers, exporters. The number of have you any information on the numbers and scale of import of civilian firearms? I'm largely thinking about recreational shotguns for shooting. Is there any indication of the level of trade GB, NI in that regard? And how can you be clear that that won't have an impact?
In the Department of Justice, we don't have that information. Import and export will be through the Department for Business and Trade. So it doesn't come across us at all. We don't have a role. Okay.
Quite significant backlogs and delays in the current firearms licensing side of things here in Northern Ireland. So an introduction of a single harmonised procedure EU but won't apply in GB. How do we guarantee that that won't cause further disruption and blockages in the system?
Firearms licensing is an operational policing matter, and they try to ensure that anyone who's applying for a firearms certificate is a fit person and has good reason to possess each firearm that they have. So we do have quite tight controls for civilian possession of firearms in Northern Ireland. And that's separate to the import and export side of things.
So you've been engaging in this, if I picked up right, from summer 2024, was that?
We were invited to join a conversation between Cabinet Office, Home Office and Department for Business and Trade colleagues who were trying to understand what the EU proposals meant. It was acknowledged that we didn't actually have any responsibility, but we were just asked if we had any observations.
Okay.
And we haven't had any further discussions since
Okay,
those
'cause
initial observations.
There's quite a number of dealers, firearms dealers in Northern Ireland. There's quite a number of representative bodies that operate on a UK-wide basis that have a significant footprint in Northern Ireland. Has there been any reach out to any of these representative bodies or dealers to assess the impact? My understanding is that those organisations are quite organised and easily assessed in terms of, they regularly feed into DOJ engagements on a number of firearms issues. And I'm just wondering whether or not we have brought this to their attention at that early stage in summer.
No, we haven't. At that stage, it was a European proposal, and UK colleagues were trying to understand the implications and outworkings of that proposal. And again, because it's outside of DOJ's area of responsibility, we weren't the lead department and haven't had any wider engagement.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
David?
Sure. This is not, to push back on you, but I think we've done it with a number of departments in the past, and I think with other departments there has been a willingness to, and perhaps those departments that are in front of us more often and got more used to the process, but where they may not be within their remit, but they have some information that they can share with us that they sometimes do. Sometimes there's a bit of tension there, but sometimes it's just slightly worrying to me that you've had that engagement, you've been part of groups that represent a number of the government departments that have responsibility in this remit. The questions that have come back are largely sort of, it's not within our remit, sorry, can't provide information on that. That does provide issues for us in terms of making decisions that some of that information is key to. And I would just, and particularly concerning the response in terms of my colleague's point that there hasn't been engagement from an early stage, because it would seem to me some of the people who would be most likely to flag any issues that they may face as quickly and early in the process, if they're engaged early in the process, would be those directly involved in the trade. So it's less a question, more that, in future around these things, I would like to see a more proactive approach from the Department of Justice in that regard, that and any government department that's involved in these issues and looking at European regulations and legislation coming forward, that they should consider at the earliest possible stage talking to stakeholders and seeing how it is going to affect them. I understand it's not always within your remit, and this committee is sympathetic to the fact that we're asking our local departments to come forward sometimes and give us a broader picture that's beyond necessarily their remit, but for whom some of the relationships and some of the stakeholder engagement is more likely to be done through them on a local level. So it's a concern that we've heard. It's not just aimed at yourselves, not just aimed at the Department of Justice. We've had these issues earlier with other departments, but I think it is important to say, Chair. Thank you.
Peter?
Great. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we have a list of bodies and organisations that I think Ray has created for us, and there's a range of sporting associations, like bodies, NGOs. Just at the bottom, give you one. There's the Ulster Clay Pigeon Association. I assume they shoot clay pigeons. I mean, that would be a really obvious one. If DOJ had been part of this process in summer 24, has there been any engagement by DOJ with organisations or retailers in Northern Ireland to say, here's what this is? How do you think that might affect you?
No, not on the proposed changes. Now, there is an existing EU regulation which this new one is replacing over time, so the existing controls remain in place. So they're trying to tighten the regime to prevent further illicit trafficking and import and export of firearms. So the legal side of things should hopefully continue as is, but we haven't had any engagement at this stage. The revised proposal from the EU has just come into effect, well, has just been published. So the initial discussions in summer were on an early proposal.
Look, I would echo the comments of my colleague. It's not about necessarily DOJ here. This is quite common. But, you know, if I was a department and I was coming before a scrutiny committee and I was going to be talking about this sort of stuff, you know, you would expect that we would ask what engagement has there been, especially with organisations or retailers who actually, you know, fix a farmer's shotgun, for example, you know, or an organisation that does clay pigeon shooting, because this, you know, these are the people that this may well affect. And to give you just one example of that, you know, the talk about ghosting and ghost firearms and the component parts. So, you know, if there's a dealer in Belcoo, you know, who does fix shotguns for farmers for pest control, and they need a particular part of that, that part may now be regulated in a way that it wasn't beforehand, and that has an impact. And he's just a trader who repairs shotguns. You mentioned as well that just to quote you back, you said you didn't believe that there were significant numbers of these movements in your earlier evidence. Could you elaborate on that? In terms of what you're talking about?
Just from initial conversations with GB colleagues, we don't get the impression that there will be huge numbers, but we don't have any further information at this stage.
So that view, Jennifer, was sort of, it's just really a view and that's based on conversations that you've had with colleagues in GB. Is that a government department you were speaking to?
Home Office, Department for Business and Trade.
Okay. Some of those groups that you were talking to.
We are still reaching out to other departments in GB to get more information.
What body would monitor those movements?
For import and export, they would require a licence or some sort of approval from the Department for Business and Trade. I suspect that HMRC may have an interest, but for import and export, Department for Business and Trade will have to give the approval.
Okay, and would that apply to a gun barrel or a firing mechanism, or?
We don't see any of those sorts of things, but based on definitions and essential components, I would expect that it would be required for each individual component as defined in the regulation.
Because in the EM, I'm going to ask, I'm not sure if this covers some of the points that Peter's raising, but in the updated EM, it's saying firearm owners are not intended to be subject to bureaucratic licensing procedures for the temporary movement of firearms, exemptions from import and export licensing for hunters, sports, shooters, collectors, and then there's also an exemption for the requirement for import authorisations, which covers evaluation and exhibition without sale, inward processing for repair, import following temporary export for purpose of evaluation, repair and exhibition without sale. I mean, I'm not sure if it's within your area to denote if that kind of these exemptions cover some of that points that Peter are making in terms of potential impacts.
Potentially, but we haven't seen any of the documents, so can't say definitively. Under the Firearms Order, which would be the legislation that we'd be familiar with, it will define firearms and component parts, and to hold them legally, they need to be on a firearms certificate granted by the Chief Constable. So if the proposed the new regulation is looking to deal with illicit manufacturing and import and export, so it would be different to the kind of things that we would have seen.
Yeah. Oh, totally understand. Peter, sorry, I interjected there.
No, Chair, that was actually very useful. Yeah. I suppose that's been useful, and I think that what the chair's intervention was useful as well. I suppose I am just frustrated that there hasn't been any reach out to obvious groups in Northern Ireland by DOJ to say, this is something that's being considered. It's going to be coming up. What do you think about it? And I'm sure a lot of those groups would actually feed back and give you a view on that. And I appreciate that you are also coming here, and perhaps not, you're the closest we have to a lead department in Northern Ireland, but that's a problem that this committee faces all the time. And I would expect departments at least to have reached out to some of the stakeholders in and around Northern Ireland to bring their views on this, as challenging as that is, given, and we've mentioned this before, the size and scope of some of these legislative changes, and also just the sheer papers involved. But I have no more questions, Chair.
David?
Got a brief point, Chair. I think there probably is an element as well of the executive at large in terms of coordination around this and how they deal with it, because I understand that some of those issues around trade and import and export is probably quite far away from what you do on a day-to-day basis, so I don't want to feel like we're honing in on you. I understand that, but we are going to have to get to a point where the executive as a whole understands that where there is a lead department in an issue, they're going to need to work with us in terms of trying to provide some of that information that they are going to have around issues that don't fall within their remit, and that's something the executive, I think, needs to look at, and how they fulfil that role in interacting with this committee. So it's not just upon yourselves to understand it's quite even in terms of the nature of the work that you do, that some of this is quite different. But where a lead department, I think, is involved in discussion forums around something coming in where they may have access to that information that the rest of us in other departments will not, I think it's important that they are going into those meetings on knowing that there may be a requirement to attend this committee and be able to furnish it with that information that is out with what they would normally do in their day-to-day roles.
You missed the opportunity to say armed with the...
armed, there you go. I'll leave the puns to yourself, Chair.
Okay. Any other questions? None? Okay, thank you very much for your evidence. Really appreciate that. So, members, you're free to go. We, again, under paragraph 8.1, Schedule 6B of 1998 Act, the committee have to decide today whether or not to hold an inquiry into the published replacement EU Act that has been notified. Should we fail to do so, or fail to decide, the failure will be treated as a decision not to hold an inquiry. So, having had regard to legal advice on whether it appears likely that the replacement EU Act significantly differs in whole or in part from the content or scope of the EU instruments which it amends or replaces, and secondly, the departmental assessment on whether it appears likely that the Replacement Act would have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities here in a way that is liable to persist, can I ask, do members wish to hold an inquiry into Regulation EU 2025/41 on firearms, essential components and ammunition? David?
I think, Chair, that it's unclear, and I think from what we just heard that there's clearly a whole host of people we would be or should be hearing from and getting more information from. I think that's patently obvious, and on that basis I would propose we do have an inquiry.
Okay. Well,
Chair, I actually think we're losing the run of ourselves a little bit in relation to some of these issues. I mean, to be clear, what we're talking about here, this is a regulation that is looking at better information sharing, so that if someone else in another part of the EU has been refused import of weapons, that we have access to that information. It's about ensuring that there are stricter rules around the components of firearms being imported to unlicensed importers to reduce against the risk of homemade weapons. This is about public safety and clamping down on illicit trade, and it's exactly the kind of issue that we ought to be collaborating on a cross-European basis on in the interests of the safety of people in Northern Ireland. And to look at this regulation and conclude that in any way there could be a significant negative impact on the community at large, I think is absolutely delusional, to be frank and honest about it, and I think we're making a mockery of this committee to propose that we have an inquiry into this particular item. I cannot fathom how anyone could have concerns about additional firearm safety proposals, and the only people that should be concerned are those involved in illicit trade. And I don't think people out there that are involved in clay pigeon shooting and sports would want to be importing illegal components or buying them unknowingly. They would want to ensure that those protections are in place. The Replacement EU Act also actually simplifies the import and export procedures for those very groups that have been mentioned in terms of hunters and sport shooters, reenactors and others. So I just think this is a nonsense, to be honest with it. I'm sorry that I'm losing my patience this morning with this committee.
Okay, Jonathan, and then we're going to move to...
Thanks, Chair. I think I need to challenge that. I think that is a gross slur on any that has concerns regarding this. To simplify this, and I think this is sometimes the problem with some members in this committee, to try to simplify that this is just about the illicit sale of illegal firearms and to tighten up procedures.
Right.
This is actually a much wider issue. I don't see Mr. Tennyson telling me that he's had any engagement with any of the representative sporting bodies that deal with firearms issues day and daily. I didn't hear any evidence from the Department of Justice, who have some form of oversight into regulations regarding firearm licensing, even having engaged with them. This also includes the issue of the transit of civilian firearms. Northern Ireland has quite a proud history of engagement in sporting organisations through shooting fraternities. It also has an issue when it comes to those that, for example, that has been mentioned with farmers and pests. There's been no engagement. This actually, what it does is creates another procedure. It's another regulatory system that does not apply in GB. So it is quite right that members in this committee look towards GB, try to establish what is the level of trade for dealers between GB and Northern Ireland, and attempt to understand whether or not this would have an impact. You may sit there and believe that it does not. I would want to know for fact before I would put my hand to anything that perhaps disables many of our sporting organisations to reach their full potential.
Thank you. Declan?
Thanks, Philip. If I may, I'd like to try and take the heat out of this particular conversation. I think it's unnecessary. Let's go back to the remit and the scope of the committee. In my opinion, proceeding with an inquiry on this particular issue is completely disproportionate to the remit of the committee. And I take a very strong view that, in fact, to oppose this particular regulation, to move into the territory of an inquiry and to continue to procrastinate on the issue, it is in fact counter to the interests of the criminal justice family in relation to this issue. So I would strongly oppose proceeding with an inquiry and urge that we stay focused on the remit and the scope of this particular committee. Thanks, Philip.
No bar, right. Everybody's had their say. We're just going to move to, we can talk politics in the chamber next week. We're just going to move to a vote. So first proposal was David's that we hold an inquiry. So those in favour of an inquiry, raise their hands. Okay, those opposed?
Okay, so the question was proposed by David, the Deputy Chairperson, inquiry into 2025-41 on firearms. Ayes, we have David Brooks, Jonathan Buckley, Peter Martin. Noes, Philip McGuigan, Declan Kearney, Emma Sheeran, Owen Tennyson and Kate Nicholl. So the proposal falls.
Okay. So moving on to item number 9, which is correspondence. So item 9.192 are quarterly status updates from RAISE on EU proposals which the committee is monitoring. 9.1 pages 315 to 317 the meeting pack relates to a proposal for a new EU Act on the welfare of dogs and cats and their traceability. The proposal is currently awaiting committee decision in the European Parliament. So once the Parliament has finalised its position, informal negotiations with the Council are then expected to begin. Item number 9.2 pages 318 to 320 of the pack relates to a proposal regarding field inspections and seed production in Moldova and Ukraine. This proposal is awaiting committee decision in the European Parliament. As with the previous proposal, informal negotiations with the Council are expected to begin once the Parliament has finalised its position. So are members content to note both updates? Okay. Item 10 on the Chair's business. Just to remind members that during the meeting 23rd of January, the committee agreed that I could approve the minutes of the proceedings of that meeting and to allow a link of them to be included in the 2 inquiry reports published on that day. So for members' information, a copy of the minutes can be found at page 322 of the meeting pack. Just also to let you know that the appointment of the British House of Lords NI Scrutiny Committee is on their order paper for tomorrow, and the committee's remit will be similar to that of the former Windsor Framework Subcommittee, which scrutinised EU legislation within the scope of the Windsor Framework as well as other legislation relating to here. So its remit is also expressly mentions conducting inter-parliamentary dialogue with the Assembly and this committee in particular. So the incoming chair of the committee, Lord Carlisle of Berriew, will be visiting Belfast next week, and he has requested that both myself and the deputy chair meet him next Thursday. So are members content that we do so? Mm-hmm. Item number 11, any other business? None. So item number 12, date, time and place of next meeting, is because we have no notifications received today and with no inquiries, we don't need to meet next week. So the next meeting is going to be Thursday the 13th of February at 10 a.m. in this room.
Thank you.
Shin Shin.
Committee Room 30, sound.